and I will deliver it to you. It's good to see such a crowd. We're at 54 participants. Let's just give it a bit more time. I see some faces. Dushan, Kakosi, Zdravo, Fleur, Bisaha. And yeah, Josip, Kakosi, Sadusha, we have Croatians and Serbians. Thank you for joining us. So I'll just say a bit of some of the rules as we proceed. If you have questions during any time in the lecture, feel free to put them into the chat. I'm just giving it a few more minutes. We're at 56. Just trying to get an idea of who's here. Okay, very good. And I do see Professor Engen here. So thank you, Professor Engen, for joining us as well. So before we begin, I will, just as we're waiting, I just wanted to ask if everyone, we could just have a moment of silence, okay? Just a minute before we proceed. All right, thank you. Thank you for that minute of silence. So without further ado, I am going to set up the lecture. So thank you for those of you who are joining me. Tonight we have about an hour, 50 minutes to be exact, because I know some of you have classes to go to discuss a conflict that cannot be discussed in 50 minutes. It's hubris, the name of this title. This title was meant to attract you, but it's really that now that I have you here, I'm going to tell you more about how hard it is to tell a history of this region. So basically, to tell the history of this region, I have to remind you going forward that this is a history. Like all history, studying history will sometimes make you feel uncomfortable. Studying history will sometimes make you feel deeply upset. Studying history will sometimes make you feel extremely angry. If studying history always makes you feel proud and happy, you probably aren't studying history. And of course, these four sentences, I can't think of a history that it applies to more than the conflict between Israelis and Arabs and Palestinians in particular. Speaking of history that makes you upset, I want to tell you about a meeting I had yesterday. It was in a room. It was a group of Israelis and Palestinians. Uh, in that hour, they went at it. They screamed at each other. They cried at each other. Each side could talk about the victims that they knew. And after that hour of having Israelis and Middle Easterners, including Palestinians in the room, there was a silence. Nothing was agreed upon. Nothing was agreed upon, but it was a catharsis. Now, when I say this meeting happened yesterday, it felt like yesterday. In fact, it was the summer of 2001. The meeting between Palestinians and Israelis and Middle Easterners, it was in the summer of 2001. It was in the island of Crete. Little did we know after that, it was a summer school meant for that purpose, to bring people who wouldn't be in dialogue otherwise to communicate. in a setting outside of their home. I'll never forget in the summer of 2001 how the Palestinian students in my cohort were in tears. There were three women who just did not want to go back to the war zone. Now, that felt like yesterday, the summer of 2001, but not too long ago, I saw similar incidents, people in tears. It's more than 20 years later. Okay. The tears are still shed. Now, of course, those Palestinians went home, as did I. What did I say? It was the summer of 2001. And when I went home on September 10th, 2001. 9/11 ensued, and it changed the world for the next 20 years. This is why we're having an event on history and the current conflict, because to this very day, what do we see repeated over and over again? That this is Israel's 9/11. Yet, it's a cautionary tale. If Israel calls it a 9/11, then it seems like they're following down the path of America, making the same mistakes the United States did in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. That's why history is so important to understand the current conflict. But in this hour, we're specifically doing that. We're looking up to the history that led to the current escalation. Speaking of 9/11, I can't think of a better opening than to refer to my guru at UCLA, a historian of Spain, yet a person who was so knowledgeable that in his history of Spain, you could see shadows being cast in the present. The terror of history. Okay. The uncertainties of life in Western civilization. If I can think of what I experienced in 2001, I and the participants never escaped the terror of history. And an entire generation in the last couple of weeks are witnessing the terror of history. Teofilo Ruiz opens the terror of history by describing the events of 9/11 10 years after. And I want you to see if they resonate with the present. So, what he writes: as social and political communities, we are constantly assailed by the unpredictability and cruelty of historical events. From the carnage of World War II to the nuclear terror of the Cold War to the events and aftermath of September 11th, 2001, to new debilitating forms of warfare, we have been shaken again and again in our sense of security. On September 11th, thousands of people died. Parts of lower Manhattan were either destroyed or badly damaged. And the carnage and symbolic meaning of the targets chosen by the terrorists had a cumulative impact on most Americans and on many people abroad. One of the outcomes was the terrorist attacks overthrew briefly, as they were intended to do, any sense of order. And now I'm digressing. What Teofilo Ruiz is describing, in other words, could be described as ontological security. Or in other words, what was threatened was our ontological security, our sense of everyday being and security that we kind of take for granted in our banal everyday lives. COVID-19 overthrew our sense of ontological security, but prior to that, to 9/11, and on right now, people's ontological security in a narrow strip of land has been disturbed. Now, I go back to Teo. The act, unexpected for most people, undermined the very foundation of trust and the ability of governments and or systems of belief to protect us or to foresee and thwart such deeds. Even if it did this only very briefly, the impact of September 11th also led to initial widespread support for unjust wars, internal restrictive and oppressive measures that may be a permanent legacy of 9/11, and a conflict with Iraq and Afghanistan already beyond its 10th year as I write these pages. Of course, it would go on for another decade. The war has inflicted and continues to inflict an unspeakable toll on an innocent Iraqi and Afghan population and has cost steadily climbing number of American casualties in both war theaters. Okay. And what are we talking about in the moment is this current conflict going to be a war in two different theaters in Gaza and Lebanon? This is nothing new, he writes. Throughout human history, unexpected catastrophes have shaken people's trust in rulers and beliefs, yielding harsh consequences. In 14th century medieval Western Europe, to cite one example, severe famines, plagues, and wars often exposed the inability of monarchs and church dignitaries to provide solace to the population or to remedy disasters. The inefficacy of royal measures or religious rituals fueled the anxieties of the populace and led them to seek answers elsewhere. In flights of religious fervor, in apocalyptic and revolutionary outbursts, and in scapegoating the less fortunate, the rulers also saw war as an option. And for more than 100 years, France and England battered each other on the battlefield. In our own times, as the case of Iraq so clearly shows, modern governments have sought to respond to crisis by striking perceived enemies and ceaseless acts of violence. So that I just leave that to you to use that and interpret it in your own way. The terror of history, learning the lessons of 9/11, that was from Teofilo Ruiz, but a very powerful podcast. It takes a particular side, but it also, without trying to go into what side this Ezra Klein takes, it also uses history to offer a cautionary lesson, the lesson of September the 11th. So, if we begin this lecture, okay, and for the students of Engen, we'll just begin from very ancient history. We'll just look at this territory without any borders, and then we'll proceed to the very present. Okay. Look at the Earth from this perspective. Okay. This is now we're dabbling in a field known as the geography of politics or geopolitics. You can get a sense how Asia, and remember the Anatolian Peninsula, or what we call today the Republic of Turkey, was known in antiquity as Asia Minor. But I want you to see how Asia Minor, what we define as the Middle East, Africa, Asia Minor on the road to Europe, all come together at a geographical fulcrum, a geographical center. If I just use this map to show kind of how peoples and ideas and goods flowed, again, now the borders are drawn, but you get an idea how this entity, I'm not giving it a name now, okay, is just so crucial to the flow of history. If the Mediterranean means the middle of the earth, okay, the middle of the middle, if you will, okay, is this narrow strip of land, okay, with mountains and a narrow coastal strip that controls the access from Europe to Asia Minor, to the Middle East, and everything going towards Asia, all the way to China, and then to Africa itself. Okay. And if I then zoom in on this topographical map, okay, you can just get an idea of how just a very narrow coastal strip represents the culmination of the Eastern Mediterranean and the gateway to the Eurasian continent and Africa as well. Now, look at the way this topographical map is situated, and then let's jump to the present. Look at this. So from the natural topographical map, this is the folly of trying to teach the history of this conflict in the remaining minutes I have. Even this graphic that I picked in 2014 is already outdated. And how can we fit the other ensuing conflicts into this infographic? Almost impossible. Yeah, even with this crammed infographic, there are still things missing, still events missing, still people missing, still conflicts that are missing. And so with this infographic, I want to, first of all, to get us to the present, I'm going to show you a video. The hardest thing of being a historian of this conflict is to teach it. It's impossible to teach this conflict in an unbiased manner. In the sense, everyone who sits and has a connection to this region will detect a bias. Having said that, I'm going to show you a video that I think does the best job out there of bringing you up to speed in 10 minutes. Okay, bringing you up to speed. So let us go to that video. Having said that, let me, first of all, just give me a second and let me, I'm going to show you the video, then we will continue with our
Come on, Hamoud.
I'm so happy to see somebody who just showed up. My little nephew is here, and that he is my most important. Okay. And Madeline, I think your microphone is on. Thank you. All right. So I have it set up. Okay. Sorry.
One of the biggest myths about the Israel-Palestinian
Okay. All right. So it's 10 minutes, and of course, I'm going to do something very annoying and interrupt and comment. Now, do you all see the video, the Israeli-Palestine conflict, a brief, simple history? Just so somebody could just hit it in the chat and say yes. No? Okay, so let me do this. You think? There we go. Now we should be able to see it. This, I think, does the best job as a historian. Okay. So let us proceed.
Palestine conflict is that it's been going on for
Okay,
centuries.
so let me just start from the beginning. And like I said, it's hard to teach this conflict. But the only thing I can say absolutely as a historian is I agree 100% with the opening sentence. And listen to the opening sentence. The biggest myth.
One of the biggest myths about the Israel-Palestine conflict is that it's been going on for centuries, all about ancient religious hatreds. In fact, while religion is involved, conflict's mostly about two groups of people who claim the same land.
Okay, in other words, you often hear that this is an ancient conflict going back to antiquity. Muslim-Jewish relations, Arab-Jewish relations, it's not a hippie kumbaya peace, okay? But by no means was it bad as the history of Jews under Christendom, leading into the modern era into World War II. That much, and we and the producers of this video can agree.
It really only goes back about a century to the early 1900s.
And yes, this is a 20th century conflict, and I would argue it's the product of imperialism.
Around then, the region along the eastern Mediterranean we now call Israel-Palestine, been under Ottoman rule for centuries, was religiously diverse, including mostly Muslims and Christians, also a small number of Jews who lived generally in peace. It was changing in two important ways. First, more people in the region were developing a sense of being not just ethnic Arabs, but Palestinians, a distinct national identity. At the same time, not so far away in Europe, more Jews were joining a movement called Zionism, which said that Judaism was not just a religion, but a nationality, one that deserved a nation of its own. And after centuries of persecution, many believed a Jewish state was their only way of safety and saw their historic homeland in the Middle East as their best hope for establishing it. In the first decades of the 20th century, tens of thousands of European Jews moved there. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and British and French empires carved up the Middle East, the British taking control of a region it called the British Mandate for Palestine. At first, the British allowed Jewish immigration, but as more Jews arrived, settling into farming communities, tension between Jews and Arabs grew. Both sides committed acts of violence, and by the 1930s, the British began limiting Jewish immigration. In response, Jewish militias formed to fight both the local Arabs and to resist British rule. Then came the Holocaust, leading many more Jews to flee Europe for British Palestine and galvanizing much of the world in support of a Jewish state. In 1947, as sectarian violence between Jews and Arabs there grew, the United Nations approved a plan to divide British Palestine into two separate states. one for Jews, Israel, and one for Arabs, Palestine. The city of Jerusalem, where Jews, Muslims, and Christians all have holy sites, was to become a special international zone. The plan was meant to give Jews a state, to establish Palestinian independence, and to end the sectarian violence that the British could no longer control. The Jews accepted the plan, and they declared independence as Israel. But Arabs throughout the region saw the UN plan as just more European colonialism trying to steal their land. Many of the Arab states, who had just recently won independence themselves, declared war on Israel in an effort to establish a unified Arab Palestine where all of British Palestine had been. The new state of Israel won the war, but in the process, they pushed well past their borders under the UN plan, taking the western half of Jerusalem and much of the land that was to have been part of Palestine. They also expelled huge numbers of Palestinians from their homes, creating a massive refugee population whose descendants today number about 7 million. At the end of the war, Israel controlled all of the territory except for Gaza, which Egypt controlled, and the West Bank, named because it's west of the Jordan River, which Jordan controlled. This was the beginning of the decades-long Arab-Israeli conflict. During this period, many Jews in Arab-majority countries fled or were expelled, arriving in Israel. Then something happened that transformed the conflict. In 1967, Israel and the neighboring Arab states fought another war. When it ended, Israel had seized the Golan Heights from Syria, the West Bank from Jordan, and both Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. Israel was now occupying the Palestinian territories, including all of Jerusalem and its holy sites. This left Israel responsible for governing the Palestinians, a people it had fought for decades. In 1978, Israel and Egypt signed the US-brokered Camp David Accords. Shortly after that, Israel gave Sinai back to Egypt as part of the peace treaty. At the time, this was hugely controversial in the Arab world. Egyptian President Anwar Sadat was assassinated in part because of outrage against it. But it marked the beginning of the end of the wider Arab-Israeli conflict. Over the next few decades, the other Arab states gradually made peace with Israel, even if they never signed formal peace treaties. But Israel's military was still occupying the Palestinian territories of the West Bank and Gaza, and this is when the conflict became an Israeli-Palestinian struggle. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, which had formed in the 1960s to seek a Palestinian state, fought against Israel, including through acts of terrorism. Initially, the PLO claimed all of what had been British Palestine, meaning it wanted to end the state of Israel entirely. Fighting between Israel and the PLO went on for years, even including a 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon to kick the group out of Beirut.
The stillness of the ceasefire in southern Lebanon was shattered today by the sound of guns, bombs, and planes.
The PLO later said it would accept dividing the land between Israel and Palestine, but the conflict continued. As all of this was happening, something dramatic was changing in the Israel-occupied Palestinian territories. Israelis were moving in. These people are called settlers, and they made their homes in the West Bank and Gaza, whether Palestinians wanted them or not. Some moved for religious reasons, some because they want to claim the land for Israel, some just because the housing is cheap, often subsidized by the Israeli government. Some settlements are cities with thousands of people, others are small communities deep into the West Bank.
If you've always felt a deep yearning for Jerusalem, now is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, not only to stand within its gates, but also to build the home of your dreams there.
Settlers are followed by soldiers to guard them, and the growing settlements force Palestinians off of their land and divide communities. Short-term, they make the occupation much more painful for Palestinians. Long-term, by dividing up Palestinian land, they make it much more difficult for the Palestinians to ever have an independent state. Today, there are several 100,000 settlers in occupied territory, even though the international community considers them illegal. By the late 1980s, Palestinian frustration exploded into the Intifada, which is the Arabic word for uprising. It began with mostly protests and boycotts, but soon became violent. Israel responded with heavy force. A couple hundred Israelis, over 1,000 Palestinians died in the first Intifada. Around the same time, a group of Palestinians in Gaza, who considered the PLO too secular, too compromise-minded, created Hamas, a violent extremist group dedicated to Israel's destruction. By the early 1990s, it's clear that Israelis and Palestinians have to make peace. The leaders from both sides signed the Oslo Accords. This is meant to be the big first step toward Israel maybe someday withdrawing from the Palestinian territories and allowing an independent Palestine. The Oslo Accords established the Palestinian Authority, allowing Palestinians a little bit of freedom to govern themselves in certain areas. Hardliners on both sides opposed the Oslo Accords. Members of Hamas launched suicide bombings to try to sabotage the process. The Israeli right protests peace talks with ralliers calling Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin a traitor and a Nazi. Not long after Rabin signs the second round of Oslo Accords, a far-right Israeli shoots him to death in Tel Aviv. This violence showed how extremists on both sides can use violence to derail peace, keep a permanent conflict going as they seek the other side's total destruction. That's a dynamic that's been around ever since. Negotiations meant to hammer out the final details on peace drag on for years, and a big Camp David summit in 2000 comes up empty. Palestinians come to believe peace isn't coming, rise up in a second intifada, this one much more violent than the first. By the time it wound down a few years later, about 1,000 Israelis and 3,200 Palestinians had died. The second intifada really changes the conflict. Israelis become much more skeptical that Palestinians will ever accept peace or that it's even worth trying. Israeli politics shift right, the country builds walls and checkpoints to control Palestinians' movements. They're not really trying to solve the conflict anymore, just manage it. The Palestinians are left.
That's the most profound. They're not trying to solve the conflict anymore and manage it. Now, this video is several years old, but it captures the problem. And this is, of course, as a historian, this is what I'm always asking is, with that, it's only a matter of time. This is not a strategy. It's only a matter of time before this failure to try to find a solution and just managing it from day to day is not going to be sustainable. Something will escalate. Something will cause it to escalate.
Feeling like negotiating didn't work and violence didn't work, that they're stuck under an ever-growing occupation with no future as a people. That year, Israel withdraws from Gaza. Hamas gains power, but splits from the Palestinian Authority in a short civil war, dividing Gaza from the West Bank. Israel puts Gaza under a suffocating blockade, and unemployment rises to 40%. This is the state of the conflict as we know it today. It's relatively new, and it's unbearable for Palestinians. In the West Bank, more and more settlements are smothering Palestinians, often respond with protests and sometimes with violence, though most just want normal lives. In Gaza, Hamas and other violent groups have periodic wars with Israel. The fighting overwhelmingly kills Palestinians, including lots of civilians. In Israel itself, most people have become apathetic. For the most part, the occupation keeps the conflict relatively removed from their daily lives, with moments of brief but horrible violence. There's little political will for peace.
And that's it. Now, keep on remember how old this video is relatively old. There's little political will for peace. And again, the same question that I'm asked is, okay, with that little political will, how long could that situation remain sustainable?
No one really knows where the conflict goes from here. Maybe a third intifada.
Maybe a third intifada where we are now.
Maybe the Palestinian Authority collapses.
Which is also a very distinct possibility.
But everyone agrees that things as they are now can't last much longer. Israel...
Except the incumbent leaders on both sides, I have to say. Everyone agrees that things can't last much longer, but the current Israeli government, the Palestinian administration, never basically tried to address this issue.
Israel's occupation of the Palestinians is too unstable to last, and that unless something dramatic changes, whatever comes next will be much worse.
Whatever comes next will be much worse. And then sure enough, and these are the producers, Johnny Harris, Max Fisher. When was this produced? 7 years ago, with 22 million views. And just look how this was good. This is why history is important, okay? Because in that history, and like I said, there's, a history like this is not going to make either side happy. Either both sides of this are going to have 5 problems with it. But as a historian, I think it does a good job. Okay, because it uses the past to ask very salient and prevalent questions, and I have been showing this video for 7 years. Always the questions I brought up to you just at this very moment tonight, I've been asking for the last 7 years, the same thing, based on this pattern. What's going to happen next? So, going back to with that video, then I go back to the presentation. So more or less, that gave us in 10 minutes an overview of what we're witnessing here. So going back to that infographic, okay? Let's just begin with 1948, 1949, and then I'll jump. I put a word here, the Nakba, okay? This is how the Palestinians will refer to that event. I only mention that because it's, as we speak, the 75th anniversary of that event. 75-year anniversary. There's another anniversary that I jumped to, the 1973 war. Okay. Almost 50 years to the date this conflict escalated. And here, this is where we see history is both a term to elucidate. You know, I tell my students, I'll never ask you for a date on an exam, but 1973 is no longer just a date, it's a symbol. You see, to make sense, okay, of this anniversary, I want you to understand what is the role of history when it's used by political actors, or we could say the politicization of history. Look, when Israelis refer to this as the second 1973, what happened? Israel was caught off guard during a religious holiday. A surprise attack was launched by Egypt and Syria. Israeli forces were overwhelmed. A barrier was broken on the Sinai Peninsula. Israel was caught off guard and suffered a lot of casualties. But then what happened? Israel countered attack, and with American aid, Israel ultimately prevailed. Now, I want you to see the way I told that story. So when you call it 1973 on the Israeli side, okay, this is the way history works. You use the past to legitimize yourself in the present, but then suggest inevitability in the future. And you see what's happening here. So when you say this is another 1973, you're saying, okay, we've had a setback, but we as a country will eventually win as long as with the US coming to our aid. But then you have the other, and I call them tropes. You see how history is also being used, referring to this as Israel's 9/11, as Israel's Pearl Harbor. You see, you could choose. You have an option of what historical event in the past you want to use, okay? But when 9/11 was evoked, see what Ezra Klein did earlier, saying, okay, you might do that to indicate your trauma, but if you're using that, what does it suggest in the future? You might be dragged into a 2 decades long war without you gaining anything. Okay. So that's 1973. The next war I jumped to is 1982. 1982, the first Lebanon war, which technically, again, there are a couple of wars that are missing. But the important thing about the Lebanon war was this. Israel moved into the south of Lebanon to expel the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, which it did. In expelling the PLO left Lebanon, moved to Tunisia, well far away from Israel's border. But look what happened. In that counter-terrorism campaign, what did Israel do? It got rid of the PLO and created a much more severe security threat. In the vacuum, what emerged? The party of God, Hezbollah. The party that, if you saw Hamas's attack with its missile arsenal, it does not compare to what Hezbollah has at its disposal. But the point was, this is one of the unintended consequences of history, you see. Israel moved into Lebanon with a military invasion. It was bloody. Beirut was bombed. A lot of civilian casualties, including in 2 refugee camps known as Sabra and Shatila. That wasn't committed by Israel, but Israel was on guard when that massacre happened. And in this chaos, what emerges? Something even greater to Israel's security. That's in 1982. Here we are in 2023. See how history unfolds. And then the other conflict they haven't mentioned was an event, a series of events that were sparked when 2 hang gliders flew from the south of Lebanon, landed in the north of Israel. The one of the pilots of the hang glider then took a rifle and killed 6 Israeli soldiers. The hang gliding attack was launched by a group known as the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine General Command. I know it's a mouthful. And that event, combined with Palestinian frustration, sparked the first intifada. One hang glider. A conflict, an intifada, a Palestinian uprising that lasted till 1993. Okay. If that one event is any indication to go by, all I'm saying is it's really hard to anticipate how long this conflict could last for. Now, those are the events. Now I want to focus on some personalities. In one circle above, you see under number 4, a person named Yitzhak Rabin, who would eventually become Israel's prime minister. He's the one who signed peace with the Palestinians. And it's quite amazing. The other person you don't see her, you hear, but you see in the video, Yigal Amir, was the one who killed Yitzhak Rabin. And it's amazing how sometimes a single assassination can change the course of history, in my opinion. That assassination really killed that one person who could have, in hindsight, I know this is counterfactual. Were he alive today, I really wonder if we would be witnessing an Israeli and Palestinian state at the moment. So Yitzhak Rabin, I put Yigal Amir in the corner. Then notice how I circle Ariel Sharon and Yasser Arafat, the Palestinian leader, and Ariel Sharon, who got elected as of 2000. And I would argue the second intifada was really about the obstinacy of 2 aging men. Okay. So I'm saying it's the aging men on both sides. And this metaphor I get is from an Al Jazeera reporter who basically said these 2 aging men are so out of touch with their younger generations. No wonder we're in this conflict. That was 2000 to 2005. Yasser Arafat died in 2004. Then I circled Benjamin Netanyahu and Mahmoud Abbas in the other corner. You don't see him here. He's the current leader of the Palestinian Authority. He's 87 years old. Benjamin Netanyahu has been more or less in and out of government since 1996. After Rabin was assassinated, Netanyahu was eventually elected. And he's been with us ever since, all the way to 2023. And again, I would say a lot of the events, the response, so much and so forth, the failure to achieve kind of any headway, is also on one level 2 old men who have so protective of their power, they've lost touch with what is ultimately good for both of their constituencies. And that is what this chart is missing. Go to the next slide. To understand this conflict, this is the Middle East and all the alliances and the conflicts. Okay. What's amazing about this, I don't expect you to make sense of this. I just want you to get impressed by the complexity of the alliances within the region. What can we say of the Middle East? We have a lot of extra regional actors. You see Russia, you see India, you see Germany and the UK. We have multilateral organizations. Sorry? We have multilateral organizations such as the EU. Sorry, somebody has their microphone on. We have multinational organizations such as the European Union. Then we have terrorists who try to act like states, such as the Islamic State. There you see Hamas in the middle of all this. You have the Gaza Strip, you have Hamas and its various alliance systems, okay? All I'm saying about the Middle East is it's not a region with concrete national actors. You have extra-regional actors intervening. You have multilateral organizations such as the EU. You have non-state actors such as Hamas that can goad a state called Israel into a conflict, okay? And the various nations around the world all react. It was a non-state actor that was basically to set every string in this alliance system vibrating. Okay. Speaking of the 1973 war, I just found it ironic. You might want to read World War Z again by Max Brooks. Okay. Even Max Brooks writes World War Z like a historian. He writes it like an oral history of the zombie Armageddon, of the zombie apocalypse. And even in that book, even Max Brooks is able to get both sides' opinions of the War of 1973. Okay. World War Z was quite an interesting historical document in the sense it's about a zombie apocalypse, but on one level, it kind of predicted COVID-19 and not only was a reflection of the 1973 war, even in this dystopian scenario, a lot that's talked about in the World War Z can help illuminate the conflict going on in the present. Now, I am going videos to just talk about some of the work I've been doing. There is a professor at California State University, San Marcos. Her name is Sasha Kimmel, whose work was so important. I had to meet with her before the winter holiday began when 2022 came to an end. Why was I so interested in her work? Was the following, published in 2019. When I look at her using the notion of now this is before a political agreement called the Abraham Accords was signed. But basically, I saw that this kind of work is important. Why? Because I could sense that things were on the tipping point, that they were at the boiling point. And this is why I was just so interested in her work in December 2022, because basically what I was saying is this kind of work is so desperately needed in this conflicted land. And of course, as you know, as it said, the rest is history. I recommend, I'm sorry, I'm not tooting my own horn, but I am. If you want to get more examples of how history can explain this current conflict, what the world can learn from the history of Hamas, I wrote this on October 17th for Time Magazine for the column Made by History. But look what I wrote yesterday before a hospital was targeted, before a hospital was destroyed on Tuesday. Look what I wrote here. And again, this is all informed by history. Nobody knows when or if this cycle of responsive violence will end. But we know that in the past, Israel's aggressive counterterrorism and focus on the threat at hand helped fuel the rise of Hezbollah and Hamas. To end this cycle, Israel needs a long-term strategy to address the root causes of terrorism. Socioeconomic deprivation, failure of governance, loss of hope, despair, and anger among Palestinians. Israel's failure to do so has led to thousands of deaths and sadly promises many more to come. And literally when that came to print, hundreds more died on that Tuesday evening. How do you find kind of solace or peace? Okay. Here's an article I wrote about about the Lebanese Civil War. And I would recommend reading that and also watching the following, a film about a massacre that took place at the Olympics called Munich. The film Munich was about a Mossad squad hunting down Palestinians all over Europe for their alleged role in a terrorist attack. The thing is, the assassinations were successful. The terrorism didn't end. It only escalated. The film was produced in 2005. It was about events after 1970, but it was really Steven Spielberg sending a cautionary message to a post 9/11 America. And again, even Steven Spielberg knows the value of history in terms of understanding the present. So I said, this event is going to end in 5 minutes. I know some of you might have classes, but we have 5 minutes for questions. And then for those of you who for those of you who for those of you who don't have to go to class, we could have questions and answers for another 10 more minutes. But I lead it to, I'm just trying to see if there's any questions.
Like Zionism, colonization, ethnic cleansing, apartheid, terrorism,
Sorry, who's talking?
Overwhelmed by these words and feel like you have to.
Sorry, who's talking?
Might be your sister. It's the
Oh, Huda, is that you?
Yes, it is her.
Huda? Huda, is that you? Okay, maybe the microphone was on or off. Huda?
There are some
Okay.
questions in the chat.
Yes. Thank you. How does it tie to the war in Ukraine? Well, I mean, on some levels, who was immediately blamed for greenlighting the attack on Hamas? Who was giving the green light for Hamas to conduct the attack was Iran. Okay. Now, I want you to think about this. Even though there's no the fact that it's debated, that there's no conclusive evidence that you see how even the guessing gives Iran a form of asymmetrical power? That even with the US worried that Iran could have sparked it or could exacerbate that, it shows kind of inadvertently that the American superpower is wary of Iran's influence. And that indirectly gives power to Iran. Yet at the same time, what else can Iran communicate? That it can have drones that even Russia needs. Even a superpower is now relying on Iranian drones, so that Iran's presence is felt in Ukraine, on Poland and NATO's borders. And that also kind of communicates Iran's power in the region. So if they're connected, I see on one level, it's Iran. Now, I just gave an interview to, so Dominic, if you want to ask, I'll write you later. I wrote a couple of articles connecting the conflict in Ukraine, as well as this conflict, in that because Russia takes Iran's side and took the side of Hamas, of course, Ukrainians are naturally going to take the Ukrainian side. And so, of course, that country has become very polarized as well. Very good. I will take Eric's question while I read the comments, and then Zainab, I'll get to you.
Yeah, switching from the Ukraine one, I wanted to talk about the hospital bombing because that's the most recent and what people are talking about. Palestinians say Israel did it. Israel's denying it. And I have trouble believing reporting coming from the region because of all the problems and biases from each side. Would we be inclined to believe Israel? Because if they bombed the hospital, that is an absolute PR disaster. And it would almost certainly drag Iran, Syria, and Lebanese factions into it. Hamas would have everything to gain. I also don't see Hamas bombing their own hospital and killing 400 plus people. So, and I see Dominic's comment about the rocket misfire. I've seen things where the timestamps were off, like the Israeli timestamps were from 8 p.m. while the bombings were like 7:20 p.m. Professor, what would you say to that? Because I have a very easy
answer for you. I have a very easy answer is one group will believe what happened, another group will believe another event that happened, and you're not going to convince either side one way or the other, no matter what evidence is provided.
Because the White House hasn't firmly said that they believe the explanation of Islamic Jihad. Right. So
that's as a historian. So, I didn't want to talk too much about what's going on, but of course we can't escape it. So let me give you, no, that's no problem. No, that you brought it up. This is the answer I had ready is, each side believes there was a culprit. And no matter what evidence you could provide to the contrary, now their side will be convinced. I just want you to think about it in terms of the warring parties. There is a middle ground, okay, that I think both sides are trying to convince, but it's not the middle ground I'm concerned about. It's the warring factions. When I say the warring factions, the conflicting sides. Exactly. This event is going to flame one to the point of, I would say, almost no return. That's the easiest answer I could give you. And so to answer your question, Danielle, that's the problem. Where do we go from here? You see, that's it. I don't see where do we go from here. And this is the first time I could say this in this conflict. This is the first time I could say this. I really can't see any kind of resolution on the horizon if either side will budge. This is what worries me so much. Before, I was just worried about the situation was unsustainable and untenable, that there would be some kind of explosion. Now that the explosion has happened, all I can say is this. I think of students I've taught, Turks and Armenians. 100 years later, they're still at it. Still not able to kind of reconcile. I think of conflicts in the Balkans, and we have a good number of the Balkans here. The young people, I'm very happy to say, are starting to get along, but you still have the political factions that still try to inflame tensions to serve their own agendas. So to answer your question, so Ms. Moser asked, what comes after postmodernism? I think this is an example of kind of our postmodern moment, is that every side will have their truth, okay? And that's it. You can't, everyone will say in this conflict, your opinion are alternative facts. So I know all of you can present the evidence, but this is what I'm just basically arguing, is that neither side, I know, so that's what I'm saying, neither side, you'll see, will change their opinion. That's no matter what the evidence you provide. So when you say people who believe this is an ancient conflict, no, I say this is a conflict that began as a result in the aftermath of colonialism and imperialism in the Middle East. It's really a conflict that took off after World War II. It had its roots in World War I. At the end of the day, it's about conflicting nationalisms. Nationalisms are modern ideologies born after the French Revolution. And so for this reason, I don't say it's an ancient conflict. When an ancient conflict then you would have evidence of Arabs and Jews going at it, and you don't. Okay, like I said, it wasn't always peaceful. Okay, but for the fact of the matter that Jewish communities could live relatively unmolested under Muslim rule into 1492, I say relatively. That's not an ancient conflict. Okay, nor for that matter. Now, were Jews equal to Muslims in the lands? No, they had to pay a special tax, okay? But, the number of pogroms you had in Muslim lands, really, you can't compare them to how many that occurred in Europe, in the Black Death, how they were blamed for, that pandemic, all the way to Tsarist Russia. Professor Engen, thank you for joining us. You have a question or comment?
Well, yeah, I have to address the question about the ancient conflict. So Dr. Al-Marashi is right that in terms of the current conflict, Jews and Palestinians, and it's connected with the concept of Zionism, what happened, Holocaust, the 1948-1949 war. That's the acute cause, right? However, history does reach far back, and what happens is modern peoples use history to justify their current positions. So the two sides here, if we're just talking about Israelis and Palestinians, they can't just fight each other and say, well, we're fighting over power, or we're fighting over land, or we're fighting over economics, or we're fighting just out of competitiveness. There has to be some kind of justification. And those justifications can often go way back. So for example, Menachem Begin, in discussing the situation of Jerusalem, he was former prime minister of Israel in the 70s, and he did sign the Camp David Accords. However, they would not give up anything concerning Jerusalem. That was one of the biggest sticking points, even in the 2000 negotiations, along with the West Bank and the settlements. And Menachem Begin said, we cannot negotiate away what God has given us. And that idea goes all the way back to ancient times, where the Jewish people believe that this is their promised land, promised to them by their God. And when you have a faith in that, and you believe that that's true, how can you negotiate that away? And then so you get these disputes about who has a right to that land, right? And so there are religious questions about that, or a component of that, if it's given to you by your God going way back, they believe. But there's also a historical component and an ethnic component of that as well, where they go back to ancient times and who was there first, Palestinians or Jews, who has a right to that land. And the problem is that's very murky because it really depends on where you draw the sort of cutoff date in terms of who was there when, and did they leave and then come back, and all of these different things. So there is an ancient component to this. It's not necessarily what they're fighting about in reality today, but people use the history and they'll go back as far as they need to go back to find justifications for their position today. So I would say there is an ancient component to it, but it's not really the cause of what's going on there right now.
Thank you, Professor Engen. I couldn't have said it better myself, and I'm so glad you attended because that's perfectly articulated. And for those of you who are in Professor Engen's class, yes, antiquity from an event. Think about how antiquity faces in the present. There's a wing of the Israeli defense, the Israeli military. They fly over the hilltop of Masada, where there was this last stand against the Romans, to basically say, when you have Israeli F-16s flying over Masada, you're basically saying this will never happen again, for example. So I mean, that's just one example that comes to my mind almost immediately. The fact that the Israeli tanks are known as Merkava, the Merkava, and for those of you who speak Arabic, it's Murakaba. That's referring to kind of the ancient chariots in the Old Testament. Danielle, do you mind? I'll give you the last word. Do you mind turning the camera on? You don't mind? Thank you, Danielle. So you get the last word, and then I see your comments. So what I think we're going to have to do in the future is perhaps we'll have a future event on this. There was just so many angles that okay, Flor, thank you for that. So of course, all the comments are there. I'm going to look it over. Perhaps we'll have a follow-up event. This has been good. I don't think a history club event has ever had close to 90 people. So this obviously is generating passions and attention. But having said that, sorry, Danielle, the floor is yours.
That's okay. It was just what I put in the chat because I noticed that there's like a rise in like anti-Jewish pattern in a lot of places when events happen in Israel. And like I think it's really valid to critique the government of Israel and at the same time, like why is there this rise in anti-Jewish hate and like Jewish, like all this behavior, especially on college campuses? Is it because like people aren't educated on what's happening or on Judaism in general? I want to avoid that on a campus.
It's actually both happens. And it depends which country. You have a rise of so in other words, and this is the irony and tragedy, is both sides become victims. So you had the death of a young 6-year-old Palestinian boy in Chicago, stabbed by his landlord, who literally lived on the floor above him. So you have the rise of hate crimes in both cases, in both regards, and across campuses. And then some campuses, you could have both phenomena in the same spaces, so that, you know, all sides are going to be victims. And it depends. In particular countries, one happens more than the other. So this is, unfortunately, I hate to say this word, is another form of collateral damage that ensues. Okay, thank you. This has been a good hour. All the questions that came to me does get saved, Eric. Eric, do you have a final word for the History Club? And also just a quick thank you to Christine of the San Diego World Affairs Council. Go to her website. That's a good local source to do events on international relations. Perhaps we'll be doing something on this in the future, but there's also a lot of excellent events on their websites. I highly recommend that you go there. One of the few civil society organizations we have in San Diego devoted to foreign affairs. Thank you for showing up. Eric, you have the final word.
I just wanted to thank everybody for coming today, and anybody who is not a member of the History Club, If you're interested, we are open to history majors and non-history majors, anybody who loves history. So if you're interested in that, please look us up. You can just Google CSU San Marcos History Club. There's a link to join, and there's also a link to join our Discord chat, where we just talk about history in general and plan events and give more information. So anyone interested, please reach out to either me or Seth. We'd be happy to discuss the history club, or Dr. Al-Marashi. He is our advisor.
I'm your advisor, yes. And if you don't mind, everyone in my graduate history seminar, if you could just stay online. I have to talk to you. But everyone else, thank you for coming for such a tragic subject, which was very hard. I was very apprehensive about giving it, but I thank you all for being very respectful and open to dialogue. And based on this, hopefully we could have now follow-up sessions. I think this went relatively well, and so I want to thank each and every one of you. Take care, everyone, and stay safe.
Thank you, Professor.
So much. Thanks for having this.
Thank you.
I'm really happy with how this turned out, by the way. This was, as Seth said, that this is the biggest turnout that we've seen. At one point, I think there was almost 90 participants. So
90 participants, and with very little timing too. I mean, we put this together really quickly. So
yes. But thank you, Professor. This was great. I'm glad that I was able to help, and thank you for putting this on, because without your initiative, this event doesn't happen. So thank you, Professor.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
Have a good rest of your day.
Okay, you too.
Oh, and how will you be able to upload this, or how will the
yeah. So I'll convert, and then just remind me to upload it.
I'll email you. Thank you again, Professor.
Yeah, please. All right, sounds good.
Okay, I'm so sorry. I know this is for your graduate students. I just have a question.